Has it changed now, Eleanor?
Brilliant. Yeah, that seems to have worked. So as Rachel said, emotionally friendly settings is something that's been around in Salford for a number of years now, and started as the Emotionally Friendly Schools project. And this is something that's worked very successfully with a number of schools in Salford, in one of our partner services in Tameside, and it's also expanding into other areas and other local authorities now. So it's a project that's definitely grown since it's originally started. And as part of that development, what we wanted to do was to expand emotionally friendly settings across other areas of sort of the children, young people settings and schools that we work with. So it's been adapted from initially being a primary age package to a secondary age. We've piloted versions with our specialist settings in Salford. There's been some work done around adapting EFS for the Jewish sector. And we've also worked on developing versions for post-16 and early years, which is specifically what we're going to talk about today. As well as the process and the manual that Rachel mentioned, and which we'll talk more about later on in this session, EFS also involves other things that those settings that are part of the programme can attend, such as the annual conference. So these have been based around an EFS theme. And it includes a range of different workshops and speakers linked to that theme. So, for example, we've had a staff wellbeing one. We've had a session that's been more focused on promoting resilience and thinking about school communities and setting communities as well. And we would always sort of take the feedback from the previous year to see what the settings who've attended would like to see in the next conference. There's also an emotionally friendly settings website, which hosts the electronic versions of the manuals. So, for example, schools who are part of the EFS process can see the early years and the post-16 versions, and those early years settings who will hopefully become a part of this as well will be able to access the manual online in that way, as well as the hard copy that comes as part of the package. There's also helpful resources on there, such as blog posts, links to different aspects of training, and more information about the EFS process if you want to go back and have a look at that. Thanks, Rachel. So when we were first thinking about developing early years EFS, what became clear to us quite quickly was that it was going to need to be quite different to the school age manual, partly because of the differences in early years settings compared to the school systems that we were working with. But also because of having to keep that sort of holistic focus on child development and the different topics that might be relevant when thinking about the emotional well-being of children of that age and the staff who are working with and caring for them. So it was almost more of a process of starting from scratch compared to some of the other versions of EFS that we've worked on. So part of what we did was to have a very early consultation process with lots of our earlier settings in Salford and with other professionals and services who work with those settings and with that age range, to try and find out from them what sorts of things it would be helpful to include in the manual, to include in the process, and to think about how that should be adapted. Once we'd got that consultation feedback, a team of us in the Educational Psychology Service then set to work on developing the early years version of the manual, which we'll talk much more about in a moment, and creating a version of the whole setting training, which is a part of the EFS process. Once we'd got a draft version of that manual and training together, we were able to pilot that with some settings in Salford, and a Manchester setting as well, to get a sense of what settings liked, what they found useful, whether there were any other things that it was felt would be helpful to include, or whether there were any other areas that we could continue working on. And the result of all that has been the final version of the manual being now ready to be launched after what I'm sure Rachel will agree has been an extensive process with the design team. But hopefully it's going to be a really useful resource for settings to use as part of their EFS journey. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, thank you. So we just wanted to share a bit of feedback from one of our settings that piloted both the manual and the training, in terms of giving a sense of what they found useful and the sorts of things that they were saying about the manual and process. So the feedback was really positive, in that there were specific areas of the manual that staff felt they could definitely see themselves using, whether that was in their interactions and the way that they supported individual children. There were things that they felt they could use in thinking about the overall setting and nursery environment, such as how they could make that communication friendly. There were things about the policies and practices as well that staff felt would be really helpful, such as constructing their own staff wellbeing policy to keep staff wellbeing very much at the front and centre of everything that they were doing, and things such as linking in with parents and how important that parental engagement and partnership is. The feedback from the pilot training as well indicated that, again, that was something that the staff found very useful. It was more than, or much more than they'd expected it would be. And they'd felt that it was going to be really helpful to them in terms of understanding children's emotional development. It was giving them lots of high quality information about that, around the importance of wellbeing for staff and for children, and keeping, again, that focus on staff wellbeing really central.
Thank you, Eleanor. So as Eleanor mentioned, we spent a lot of time adapting the early years manual to make it different from the school age version. So you can see on the left hand side of the table the 4 areas within the school age version for primary and secondary schools are now post 16, and how we've adapted that slightly for the early years version. So it's very much a flexible programme, that it's meant to be a whole setting approach. And the idea is that it acts as a framework for embedding existing good practice around emotional health and wellbeing, whilst also helping to identify key areas for development, and using the manual to think about how you're going to put new things in place or develop things or enhance things that you already have in place. So the first part of the manual looks at adult wellbeing, and we always start with staff wellbeing because, as Ursula mentioned, it's so important to look after your own wellbeing and be able to regulate your own emotions in order to support the children in your settings. So the wellbeing section, the staff wellbeing section, takes up a good chunk of the adult wellbeing chapter of the manual. The first part looks at guidance for managers, so what it is that managers or the leadership team can put in place around policies or structures to support staff. And then it has a section around guidance for all staff, so what you as an individual might do to support your well-being, and Erica and Carla are going to do a session on staff well-being after the break, alongside things that you can do as a team to support each other. And we've been hearing so much through some work that we've been doing recently around staff well-being in the early years, how much is happening in early years settings and how much you're all doing for each other, and it's so inspiring. We've learned a lot, I think, that we've been taking back to our own team. And with the early years manual, we really felt that the importance of parents and carers was even stronger within the early years, thinking back to what Ursula's just mentioned around that rapid brain development in the first 5 years of life, and thinking about how we can support parents who are perhaps struggling with their own well-being and how that's maybe influencing their ability to parent or be emotionally available and responsive to their children. So we've developed a section which looks at things that can perhaps promote or get in the way of parenting capacity and their ability to be responsive to their children's well-being. And we've tried to write the section in a way that's very parent friendly, so that you as a practitioner can perhaps get some ideas about how you might have those conversations with parents, or if they perhaps make a disclosure or share some information with you, you feel confident to offer them some signposting, know to say the right thing. So we've covered sections around the toxic trio, so things that are known within the literature to impact parenting, such as experiencing domestic abuse, substance misuse, things like that, as well as thinking about the needs of particular parents, like young parents who are perhaps very young themselves when they're having their children, and the support that's available out there for young parents. So we've tried to organise these into fact sheets so that you could print them or photocopy them and give them to parents, or just as practitioners use them yourselves to have more confidence around conversations with parents in relation to those areas. The next section of the manual looks at policies and practices. So this is similar to the sort of classroom and whole school practices within the school age manual. And this looks at things like your nurturing environment, what is the physical environment like, as well as how as adults you're responding to children, thinking very much about what Ursula's just talked about around how co-regulation supports self-regulation. It looks at behaviour policies, which again Ursula touched upon, as well as things like SEN processes and practices, how you involve families and encourage their engagement in your setting, in their child's development. It also looks at ways in which you share information and ensure there is a consistent approach across your setting. So things like one-page profiles, which I know many of you are familiar with, alongside structures like visual supports and visual strategies, which are really helpful for children with communication difficulties or children who are particularly anxious and worried and like to know what's happening next as part of the day, but actually support all children, as well as lots of information around key points like transitions. The next half of the manual looks at supporting children and young people who've maybe got some identified needs. So the assessing children's needs section is broken down into two areas. So the first is around knowing the child, and this is about exploring the child's world and working with their family to get a good sense of that child's interests, preferences, and what their views are. And we've tried to really think about how you'd capture the views of children who are non-verbal, who have perhaps got communication difficulties, so that you can do that for all children. And then it goes on to think about how you might gain the facts. So how you might gain some evidence or data to back up what you're perhaps seeing or observing or parents are sharing with you. So that's things like tracking tools, using play-based assessment, how you might use observation in a really structured way to get some key information about a child's development and track their response to intervention, alongside introducing some standardised assessment tools. Some you might be familiar with, like the Ages and Stages questionnaire, some might be new to you. And then the final section is the big section. It got bigger and bigger as we were developing it, because we just felt there was more and more that we could put in. So this can be a resource or a manual that you can dip in out frequently, and it's kind of like your one-stop shop. So you can go to this to find out anything you need around children's emotional well-being and development. So within the school age version, it looks at 10 sort of commonly occurring difficulties that young people experience in schools, but we didn't feel that was quite right for early years children, because such an early stage of their development, but also because so many areas of their development are interlinked. So we've covered 5 key areas to make sure there's a really holistic understanding of children's development. So we've thought about physical development. As Ursula's just mentioned, that's hugely important and linked to self-regulation skills. So we look at healthy body, healthy mind. We look at how children develop physically in the first 5 years of life, so that typical development, the things that can really promote the development and how that links to emotional well-being, as well as things that you might put in place for children who are presenting with some difficulties. Emotional development is structured in the same way, that explanation of what you typically expect to see at each milestone, then the strategies, the approaches that you might put in place at a whole setting or a whole group level, as well as the more targeted interventions you might want to use for children who you're noticing have some additional needs. Managing feelings and behaviour looks a lot at attachment theory, at co-regulation, at behaviour management, and how you might understand what a child's behaviour is communicating to you. And then communication, interaction and play skills are structured in the same way as emotional development and healthy body and healthy mind. So I'll just go on now to show you some of the pages of the manual, which, as Eleanor mentioned, we've worked very hard with the design team to hopefully make these appealing and helpful for you to navigate. So we've tried to structure it in a way that helps you easily find the information. So all of the chapters start with a very clear contents page, We have reference between the different chapters, so where things are interlinked, we've included the page number and the section to refer back to, which was a bit of a nightmare when putting it together, but hopefully should make it very easy for you to move between the different sections and also within the child wellbeing for different areas of development. We've also used some key headings, so there's things like top tips, which you might want to refer to if you're quickly looking for some information, or if as a SENCO you might want to pass on those top tips to an adult who's perhaps working with that child or with their parent. And then we've also included headings of things like questions to consider, so that you can use the materials in a team meeting to maybe think about your own processes and policies, the things that you currently have in place, everyone's shared understanding of why you do things the way that you do, or how you might want to improve or develop those. So this page here is the beginning of adult wellbeing. All of the adult wellbeing content is blue. So as I move along, you can see here, we've included information about developing a staff wellbeing policy. This is something that we'd really recommend settings have to think about and structure the support that's offered to staff. We have one as an educational psychology service. And to help you maybe get started on that journey, if you haven't got one already, we have included an example which you can take and use and adapt to your own settings needs. And as I mentioned, there is a section within the adult wellbeing chapter that looks specifically at guidance for parents and carers, how you as a practitioner or setting might support parents, and how you may have some of those tricky conversations with them and signpost them on to further support. This is an example of the policies and practices section. So it's in green, this chapter, and we go into a lot of detail about that key person role. As Ursula mentioned, sometimes we can get into habits, or we do things because that's just the way that we do them, and we perhaps don't understand the theory of why we might have the key person role in settings and why it's so valuable. Or it might be that these are good resources to use with newer members of staff who are joining the team, who perhaps haven't got much early years experience, as a way to gently introduce some of the concepts around attachment theory to them, on which that key person role is based. There's a big section on SEND processes and policies, and how you might make sure they're very clearly communicated with them amongst the staff team and to each other, but also to parents. We recognise that it's often you guys as early years practitioners who are raising those concerns and having those first conversations with parents, parents who perhaps hadn't thought that their child is experiencing any additional difficulties prior to them starting at setting. And so some of those conversations can be tricky, and you might need to go on a bit of a journey with them. So this section thinks about how you might do that sensitively, as well as how you might communicate SEND processes to parents, because it can be very confusing. It's a whole new world that they're being exposed to. And I am aware that Starting Life Well are currently working on some training and some resources to help you as practitioners in settings navigate the SEND process. And then it also includes some nice examples and templates of things that you can use, such as a one-page profile there that's on the right-hand side of the slide. And wherever possible, in the references and resources section, which is the green box underneath, we have included hyperlinks, so that if you want to find out further information, do some more reading, you can just click on it and it'll take you straight to a web page. Or we've tried to provide examples or templates. So again, you can just click on it and it'll bring it up, so that you're not having to do any extra research. It's all there for you. The Assessing Children's Needs section is orange, and as I mentioned, there's sort of two parts of that. The first is around getting to know the child and explore their understanding of their world, and the second half is around data gathering and gaining the facts. It also has a big section on play-based assessment and how you might use play as a way to assess a child's skills and then measure their response to intervention. So the table there shows a number of different key cognitive skills or thinking and learning skills that children develop in the early years, and the types of activities that you might do to test them out, to check them out. And they're examples of the fact sheets I mentioned around some standardised assessments, some of which you might have come across before, like the ages and stages of questionnaire. But again, that might be good to give to newer members of staff or less experienced members of staff who perhaps haven't had experience of working with health visitors or the completion of those 2-year stage checks. And then some resources that you might not have come across before, perhaps, like the Boxall profile. So it gives you information about what the resource does, how you can use it, the costs, and how you could access it. The child wellbeing section is purple, and as I mentioned, it's huge. So here you can see the contents page is broken down into the different areas of the development, and then each section then starts with another contents page. So hopefully that helps it easy for you to navigate. So you can see there, managing feelings, communication, interaction, and play skills. This is an example of an intervention, so mindfulness in the early years, which Carla and Erica are going to talk more about in the following session, and you'll get to hear from Charlene at Kidderwinkles, who has used this intervention, and she gives her honest review of how it's gone. The manual is available sort of in 2 formats. So once you engage with the EFS process by having your initial whole staff training, you will get access to the manual through our Emotionally Friendly Settings website. So you can get an online version, which you can look at online, you can print yourselves, and you'll also get a hard copy of the manual as well, so a printed version. Further examples of the sections from the child wellbeing, emotional wellbeing part, and this is our EFS website. So as I mentioned, you get access to the manuals there. There's lots of information about the EFS approach, and there are regular resources and blog posts. So I think that'll be the place that we host the slides and the recordings from today's event. And we've done previous blog posts that are linked to early years. So we did a transition one in September to support children's return to setting and that transition to school following the first lockdown. And we also have an annual conference, which early years settings will be more than welcome to join us with and engage with once you've started the EFS journey.
So we just wanted to talk to you a bit as well about what the actual EFS process looks like at the different stages of that for the settings who are engaging in it. So as a first step, we would ask the settings to complete a series of audit tools. And these are sent out electronically as a Google form, but there's also hard copies of them in the manual. And what these look at is each of the 4 areas of EFS that Rachel mentioned before. And they ask a series of questions which are there just to get a sense of what's already going well and what sort of things are already in place that staff feel really confident about. And then also those areas that perhaps staff feel less confident about or could be areas for development. So all of the staff would complete those prior to the initial whole setting awareness training. So this is an 1.5-hour session for all the staff in the setting. And it gives some initial information about what emotional development and wellbeing looks like in the early years and why that's so important. It thinks about taking a holistic overview of a child. So thinking about all the risk factors and all the protective factors that might be relevant to their wellbeing and thinking about how best to support them. And it thinks a bit about the importance of staff wellbeing as well and why we make that such a priority, as well as giving some information about the EFS process itself and the different aspects of that. So although we would normally sort of do that as an 1.5-hour session, with sort of currently delivering that virtually and obviously wanting staff to be able to access it, it might be that we can deliver that over 2 sessions, for example, to tie in with setting staff meetings in the evenings. But that's something that could be discussed with your area Senko if it's something you're interested in signing up to do. Following that initial awareness raising session, we'd ask each setting to identify a team of EFS champions So these are going to be the people who've got a real interest in carrying this forward and putting together an action plan to help the setting develop their practice around emotional wellbeing across all of those areas. It would ideally be a reasonably big team. Obviously, the exact number would depend on the size of the setting and the size of the staff team that you've got. But what we wouldn't want is for all of that responsibility to sort of fall to one person. It would very much be a team approach and something that a few different people are taking responsibility for. But it is really helpful if that team can include people who've got a range of roles in the setting. So it might be that the manager's part of that, but then you've also got someone who works in the preschool room, you've got someone who works in the baby room, or whatever it might be to cover those different roles. And what we would ask the EFS champion team to do is to meet with members of the Educational Psychology Service for a 2-hour action planning meeting, where we look at what's already going well, what are real strengths for the setting around your practice, and help you to put together an action plan that covers each of the 4 EFS areas, which you would then be able to take on and put in place and review as part of your becoming and working on being an emotionally friendly setting. Has anyone got any questions about the EFS process or what's included?
If you do have any questions, feel free to shout out or add it to the chat. In this morning session, lots of people were asking how they can access the manual, and the process for that would be to get in touch with your area Senko following today's session to say that you're interested in becoming involved in the programme, and then from that we can set up the dates for your whole setting training. Once you've had your whole setting training, you'll get the password to log into the members area of the website, and you'll get a hard copy of the manual. And then we'll support you through the action planning process and auditing process that Eleanor's just mentioned. I'd definitely say get in quick whilst you can if you are interested in becoming involved, because currently for this year it's being funded by Starting Life Well. I think the real cost of it being delivered by an EP is about £1,000 per setting, but this is subsidised by about half that amount for schools and will currently be free to early years settings for this year. So do get in quick, and as I mentioned, we're available to start rolling this out after today's event, and we can fit around your team meetings as needed. Okay, well, thank you for listening. That's emotionally friendly settings. We're going to have a 15-minute break now, because I appreciate you've been listening for a while. So if we can come back at 2 o'clock, we'll be starting with staff wellbeing, which is going to be delivered by Carla and Erica. And you'll have a chance to learn more about mindfulness in the early years, which is a way to support your and the children's wellbeing. Thank you. If people do have any questions, do put them in the chat. Myself and Eleanor will be around over the break.